My name is Anna Karlgren, and I work as an advisor on migration at Church of Sweden. And I have the pleasure of moderating this talk. And I am happy to introduce the two speakers of this talk. First of all, Ben Ryan, Home Affairs Advisor at Church of England. Ben leads the Church of England national policy and project responses to migration, including around refugee policy and modern slavery. He has written on migration and ethics and on populist politics and religion. Welcome, Ben. And I'm hoping we have Mårten Löfberg here as well. Mårten is Secretary General at Swedish Refugee Law Center. And he's an expert in international law, human rights, and migration policy. He has a background of service with intergovernmental agencies, NGOs, Swedish government agencies, political institutions, and diplomatic missions in Africa, Latin America, Europe, and the Middle East. Welcome, Mårten.
Thank you.
So for those of you who are listening or watching, I will try to save some time in the end for questions. If some questions come up during this talk, so please use the chat function for this. So let's start. According to the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948, everyone has the right to seek and to enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. And this is supported by the 1951 Refugee Convention and the 1967 Protocol relating to the status of refugees. And the Refugee Convention is the cornerstone of today's asylum system. However, there are those who claim that the Refugee Convention created after the Second World War is outdated and is inappropriate to deal with contemporary challenges. And some even think the Refugee Convention should be scrapped altogether. What would your response be to this? Ben, do you want to go first?
Yes, thank you. I think it's an interesting and difficult question that we have in arguments with our politicians here, because I think there are aspects of the convention that I would want to say don't go far enough, that don't necessarily meet all contemporary challenges. I mean, to give just two examples from our work, the absence in the convention of anything specifically around gender and gender-based violence, that has meant that in some of our casework, and particularly with women escaping gender-based violence, it's often been more difficult for them to get asylum in the UK than I would say it should be. It's sort of covered, but not explicitly, and that creates kind of ambiguity and difficulty. And similarly, the absence of anything on climate, I think that's going to be a huge issue for the future. In fact, it's a huge issue for the present about what we do with people displaced by climate. But what I would also say is, coming from the other end, it's the best thing that we've got at the moment. And this talk, which I guess is about threats to the convention and the system, I'm sitting in a UK context where we have things going through Parliament, which I would say fatally undermine what the convention was designed to achieve. And that is not in a progressive way. That is in a way which I would consider to be very negative for the experience of refugees. So that is growing on kind of both sides, but what I often find myself torn slightly between is, how do we help to try and expand what we've got without losing the ground that we've already won, which seems to be under threat to me.
Thank you. Mårten, what is your take?
Yes, thanks. I think it's an important question to raise, and one that we have been involved in discussing for many years. And I think that Ben has raised a few very important valid points. And I think that, as you said, Anna, of course, the convention was created with, in the aftermath of the Second World War, and with the worldview of that time and the conditions regarding both financial and technical possibilities of moving at that time. I mean, very few people would actually be in question to actually move at the time of the convention, and at the time of the creation of the convention and the adoption of the convention. And I think that, of course, there are areas, Ben mentioned a few, where you could perhaps consider that those reasons that were considered legitimate reasons to migrate actually are different today, and there are probably more of them today. And it does reflect the reasons that were viewed as legitimate reasons to migrate, legally legitimate reasons to migrate in 1951. So on the one hand, yes, there should be a discussion on whether this is enough, and whether it does cover what we do today think are the legitimate reason to move. However, as also Ben pointed out, there is, of course, in practice, given the political landscape of today, there would be an enormous risk in opening up a discussion for making changes in the convention, because the vast majority of those wanting to make changes in the convention today would be those that want to weaken it, and not those that want to strengthen it from the individual right point of view. And therefore, I would be very careful. Of course, perhaps the most striking problem with the convention, and that puts it in that makes it stand out, comparing it with other international legal frameworks, is that on the one hand you have an obligation of the states to offer protection to the individual refugee, but there is no treaty body, or there is no other way to enforce, or there is no way actually that the states can be held accountable if they in essence make everything for the individual not to be able to materialize this right. And we're talking about this in the concept of legal pathways, but of course it's a fundamental issue that you have a right that people can basically not use, and that the same states that are obliged to offer protection actually to do everything they can to stop people from enjoying the right to protection. So this is something very particular about this convention and about this legal framework if you compare it to other legal instruments, and that's of course a deficit.
Thank you. In my perception, you said that those who want to change the convention wants to weaken it, or might want to think that states should leave it altogether. From my perception, this is becoming more mainstream today. Do you agree with that, or is it just in my mind?
Well, we should go first.
Go on, Mårten.
Yes. All right. No. Yes. Yes. I think so. I think it has become more legitimate to put in question fundamental human rights in general, compared to the last 70 years of development of the international human rights system, and you can do it more bluntly and more openly than ever before. And I think what you've seen on the borders between the European Union and Belarus recently, what you've seen on the borders of Greece, what you've seen in the policies coming out from countries like Denmark or Hungary recently, if not trying to undermine the convention, at least they're really narrowing it to the very brink of being something that makes it irrelevant. And if the response of the EU, not least also the EU institutions, the European Commission is very worrisome, because you would expect the Commission to realize that their role, first and foremost, is to make sure that European Union member states respect the common regulations and the EU law. But this has not been the reaction. Rather, the reaction from the EU and all the member states has been to propose exceptions to weaken the European Union regulations when it comes to the obligation to offer protection to refugees, and this is very worrisome. So yes, I would say it becomes more mainstream, and you have very few voices. You have many voices from governments that raises the situation with Belarus as a threat to Europe, but no one, I haven't heard any raising it as what it is, a threat to fundamental human rights and to the right to asylum in general. And this is, of course, a clear sign of something new and very worrisome.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. I mean, sitting within certainly within the UK context, which has obviously left the EU, and so much of the narrative since then and around Brexit and everything else has been about, the word is control. That's the word. We want to be able to in the UK government's eyes, to treat asylum as an immigration route like any other, where you can cap it at a particular point, you can control it, you can predict how many people there are, you can predict where they're coming from, you can choose the sorts of ones that you want. Now, none of this fits in with the spirit, or even in some cases, possibly the letter of the 1951 Convention. But this has been the kind of approach of the UK government, has been to say, well, we're going to remain signatories to the convention. We want to be clear about that, because it's bad to withdraw from international conventions. But we are going to produce our own interpretation of what we think that means, and put that into UK domestic law, to say that, for example, as is going through Parliament at the moment, it will be the case that refugees can be treated differently depending on their method of arrival. So whether they've come through irregular means by boat, they can be treated differently, even in the case of registered refugees, in terms of housing and support from those who've come through a resettlement scheme. That is a huge shift, definitely nothing which was projected by the convention. It's a dangerous shift. It's a shift which is, which taken to its logical conclusion would simply mean that every refugee would have to stop at the first country they came to, and overload those border states. But this is the way in which policy has been moving, and that has become mainstream. This is a bill which is passing through our parliament at the moment.
So I heard the UNHCR representative in Britain. She was talking about this differences on how you treat the refugees when you come to England. This proposal, and she did not agree with it. And but what can we do as civil society actors or just individuals? What can we do when these ideas or criticism of the convention become more mainstream?
I mean, it's hugely difficult when you have legitimately democratically elected governments who are pursuing these kind of aggressively hard lines on asylum and refugee issues. In our case, the government here has a strong majority. It, if necessary, can force through any legislation it wants, regardless of what kind of opposition you put up. So we need to look at two things. One is kind of immediate short term. How do you fight particular pieces of legislation? But the other is kind of a broader cultural thing. Governments only feel confident bringing through this legislation because the feeling is that is popular, that has mainstream support. We're not going to win, I think, in some cases by changing the minds of individual politicians unless we can address that broader cultural issue, where we can begin to address people's misconceptions of who refugees are, how many there are, where they're coming from, why they're coming here. The media narrative in the UK continues to be about criminals. It continues to be about Islamic extremism. It continues to be that everyone is coming here to take advantage of a generous welfare state. We have lost that narrative battle to some extent in fighting that. And the task, I think, for civil society has got to be to change that narrative back. It's got to be to kind of present the alternative stories and to win people round individually, collectively, as groups, through the media, through events, through the kind of work which goes on at the grassroots. And only then, I think, will we begin to get the kind of bleed through into the political space. Politicians are fundamentally reactive. That they follow what they think is going to be the popular policy. That is an inevitability. As a result, there's limited scope in some ways for fighting individual bills because the culture will mean that they come again. Whereas if we can change that kind of cultural space, that's where we might not see these policies coming through in the first place.
Do you agree, Mårten, or do you have a different perspective?
No, I do. I do agree, and I think it's we have to prepare for that is going to get worse before it gets better. When it comes to the conditions under which we work with these issues, and I mean we are facing a massive wall of propaganda and uninformed debate. In the Swedish case, I would say that the migration debate really stands out as an area of discussion in society where the level of knowledge is very low. And I think what we have to do to connect to your actual question, we would need to, as civil society, we would need to, I think one of our most important tasks is to contribute to an informed debate. I mean, in the sense that people do actually realize what are the truths on the ground, and the truths on the ground are that Lebanon is hosting, half of their population is basically refugees, and that 1 million people came into Europe in 2015, and that's not necessarily very many, and not even Sweden and Germany, who took the biggest share, so to say, of responsibility, did have any significant cracks in their system as a consequence. This is mainly based on myths, and I think it's important to speak clearly and openly about it. And I also think it's important to remember that despite this massive propaganda efforts by certain political and other forces around this, and portraying it as a threat to national security and all sorts of things, despite that, there is in many European countries there is still an important popular support, and that popular support for a humane and informed and well-balanced migration policy needs also somebody to go ahead and show that this is possible and how it can be done and how it should be done. Because I will just finish by saying that this question will not go away from the agenda, however much some politicians might want that to happen. This together, international migration together with the consequences of climate change, will remain, in my view, the two most important issues of our time to deal with. You need to deal with them whether you want it or not. You cannot put your head in the sand and forget and pretend it doesn't exist. So governments will have to deal with it, and therefore we need an open debate and not shy away from it.
Can you want to add something?
Yeah, can I just come back on that point? Because I think that's right, but I think one of the important points there is we get ourselves, certainly in my context, often trapped fighting at loggerheads of government or with other groups who just want to. If we're simply always at that kind of two different poles fighting at each other, it's very difficult to find meaningful routes forward from that. People tend to double down more than they concede when it becomes a political battle. One of the areas in which we have begun to see useful cut through on things like, to a limited degree, refugee integration, modern slavery work, has when we've been able to offer ourselves as legitimate partners to government rather than simply an outside critic. So although it's on a small scale, I think my colleague Domenica is giving a talk later today about some of our experience with Afghan refugees, but her work in community sponsorship has been a really good example. This is a direct partnership between the churches, between civil society group and the government in providing, for a small number of people, a very intensive integration and wraparound support service. And similarly with modern slavery, we've done similar things. In this way, we've been able to get meetings with people in government where we've been able to say, well, we're a legitimate actor. We're not just throwing rocks at you from the sidelines. We are partners working on some of this. We're prepared to kind of put our money and our effort and our volunteers behind some of this. And that has opened up more doors than perhaps were open previously. But it's difficult when then they come up with legislation which you find so difficult. You think, well, are we complicit if we then, if we make deals, if we're kind of trying to do anything? Where do you draw that line is a really difficult question for all kind of civil society groups.
So both of you,
Very valid point there,
you talked about legislation, and you talked about what's happening at the borders in Poland, Belarus, and in Greece, Turkey. But if we look at the practice, what do you see as the main threats to the right to seek asylum, Mårten?
Yeah, I think it's what we mentioned. I mean, it's in the European context. It's certainly, you know, it's the lack of serious and informed debate on the, you know, this is the background. But what actually happens on the ground is that you see governments governments and other political actors, political parties, openly questioning their obligations according to the convention, according to international refugee law. And what you've seen on the borders to Belarus is, of course, outrageous. You know, you have thousands of people staying under most inhumane circumstances and denied actually the right to an asylum procedure, which is very, very clearly stated in European Union law. And the reaction to this is that European Commission, instead of saying like to the member states, you need to respect you know, our common rules and regulations, they say, okay, we can make exceptions. You don't need necessarily to follow these regulations. So fully. So this is of course a clear tendency to something. I think it should be put in context of the you know, more and more put in question and undermining of international human rights principles in general. And this is very clear examples of it. But you see you know, more and more tendencies to fundamental democratic freedoms also being questioned, put in questions, both in essence in the systems of states and policies of government, and in the mindsets of leading politicians and political actors. And I think this is extremely worrisome. This is something we're going through, and it will get worse before it gets better. But we need to continue to struggle for the universality of human rights, which is also, if I may add, an important point to all this is when discussing the convention, and the fact the convention is 60 years old or more, is that there is, of course, a fundamental conflict of interest between, on the one hand, the concept of the nation state and citizenship, which in its essence means exclusive rights and privileges to some, and the universality of human rights on the other hand. It's a conceptual conflict, which an interest conflict, which becomes more and more acute the more people that can actually move. And that is an important development in the last 60-70 years, that more people can move technically and financially, and therefore this conflict of interest becomes more acute, and we will need to deal with it.
Thank you. Ben, from your perspective, what are the main threats to the asylum system today?
Well, first and foremost, and Mårten has touched on this, you know, the global context is the biggest threat. You know, there's 82 or whatever it is million people displaced in the world. Many of them internally, many of them remaining within the global south. But, you know, we're talking a vast number of people displaced and projected to rise, you know, and with environmental catastrophe, with the long-term effects of the pandemic, with, you know, mounting conflicts in a number of places, that number is going to rise. And of course, there is a desirability among some to therefore seek refuge in Europe, and therefore the numbers are not going to go down. You know, as Mårten has already said, there comes a point where governments have to intervene, but there is fear with that, an understandable fear that what are you going to do with this huge number of people? And these unpredictable circumstances, you know, what are you going to do to fix that? I mean, within a kind of UK context, you know, our biggest refugee scheme at the moment is about Afghanistan, because of course the UK was so involved in Afghanistan, and the kind of the sort of consequence of that is having to design a program to support people who to an extent are, particularly in the case of kind of translators and people who worked with the UK armed forces and things like that, but also more generally with Afghan citizens. That's going to be a large program, but that is the kind of thing which terrifies governments, having to design major schemes quickly that they haven't really had time to think through, that seems out of their control. And the result of that is when you have the big panic within the UK government at the moment is people arriving through the English Channel and people arriving by boat. Because they're not controlled, they're not predictable, and because the numbers are high and the right-wing press is saying you've lost control. There's thousands of people arriving on the beaches, hundreds every month. You've lost control. What are you doing? You're meant to be a government which said they were going to sort out immigration. Why have we got hundreds of people arriving by boat? That's the biggest threat, is that because governments get overwhelmed by this kind of fear of this global context, the only levers they reach for are shut it down. Let's kind of end this system or dramatically reduce it, encourage pushback, stop people arriving, bring in the military, everything which can be done to stop that occurring. That is a threat.
Yeah. When you mentioned pushbacks, a couple of days ago, the UNHCR High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, he warned of increasing violence and human rights violations at the European borders. And in this statement, the High Commissioner referred to interviews with thousands of people across Europe who were pushed back and subjected to intimidation and violence. Do you think this pushbacks is becoming more normalized?
I think so. I mean, certainly it's now something which the UK government has been actively considering for the channel, and I think that taps into something broader, which is that there is a kind of increasing kind of international linkage in cherry picking the policies which different governments have gone for. So the UK government actively looks at what goes on in Australia. They look at what happens in Greece. They look at what happens in Denmark, and they say, oh, okay, so that's an idea which they've used there as part of a deterrence policy. We shall reinvent it here. And that, I think, is becoming more and more normal as different governments look around, and it becomes a race to the bottom. It becomes, well, if that government is using pushbacks, if that government is using accommodation centres, then then the window is open. Then clearly this now is something which hasn't been internationally condemned. That's an acceptable measure. And what hasn't, I think, quite had the counterweight to that has been people saying, okay, but what are the positive things which are working in different places, at a civil society level as much as anything, for a kind of world of neighbours perspective? How do we cherry pick the good things which are going on in some of these countries and take those into different contexts? So that conversation, I think, is a more limited one.
Mårten, do you have any thoughts on pushbacks and if they are becoming more normalized?
Yes, yeah, of course they do, let's not forget that the right to asylum is a fundamental human right. Pushbacks are a violation of that human right. It's illegal under international law. It's illegal under EU law, and it's probably illegal under most national legal frameworks as well. There is no other way than trying to create the debate and trying to make sure that you cannot do whatever. You cannot violate fundamental human rights, and you cannot violate fundamental international legal obligations without consequences, at least the naming and shaming consequences. And today that's not happening. Today you can do that. Today you can be Poland and engage in, without any doubt whatsoever, pushbacks activities, or Greece, and nothing happens. And this is and I want to raise again the responsibility here, both of other governments, but also in the case of the EU, of the European institutions. They need to act to uphold the common rules, and they don't. And this is very, very, very worrisome, because what is the next step what human rights are next to be undermined and no one to react.
So, I mean, the civil society organizations, legal practitioners, and individuals who give humanitarian assistance to people on the move, it has become increasingly difficult for them to work in these in recent years. And they are faced restrictions, sanctions, punitive measures, and some have even faced criminal prosecutions for assisting migrants. What can we do to counteract this trend to criminalize solidarity? Ben, do you have any thoughts?
It's part of a similar debate, isn't it? And you don't want to sound hopeless about things. You don't want to, but it's a difficult environment to be operating in. And you know, I remember that from the meetings of our cohort a few months ago. That often that kind of slight exhaustion and fatigue of kind of fighting the same battle over and over again is what eventually kind of grinds people down. I have some hope on some of the kind of I was interested in the UK context that one idea which got thrown out quite aggressively, including by lots on the political right, was a move which would have criminalized assisting people at sea. If so, for lifeboats, for example, if they had assisted a refugee boat that was sinking, whether they would be open to criminalization. And this did receive a significant, backlash from across civil society, including from people who were not the kind of usual suspects, who are not just the people who are pro-refugee. It had a general kind of, well, what are you on about? You can't just let people drown. So I think that there remains some reasons for optimism to think, that things aren't as bad as we think, but clearly in other cases we are seeing that criminalization, we are seeing that difficulty in particular areas, and we just have to keep up the kind of fight and the pressure on that, I think.
Mårten, do you have some reflections?
Yeah, no, I also think that you can't do this kind of work if you are not somehow an optimist and you believe that you can make a difference. And of course, on the individual level, we can. And that's, I think, it's a civil society. We shouldn't forget that that's what we need to do. And we're going through an era where of world development, where human rights, where humanitarian principles, where international legal norms in general are increasingly on the rollback. This is a fact. The world has been through these eras before, most clearly, during the 1920s and 1930s and 1940s in Europe, and what we need to do is, I think, as civil society, we need to be clear, to remember our values, to remember that this is not a matter of statistics, but about human lives and individuals. Put faces to the statistics, contribute to an informed debate, and to also make sure that there are other voices in the public debate, and that there are leaders, if you want, in the debate that can create opinion also from a different perspective, and not only from the perspective of national security and nationalism and so on. And it is a difficult moment to work with these issues today, and that's perhaps the biggest reason why we have to continue.
Yeah, you said security, you talked about security. And I mean, for several years, border protection, security has been the focus of the political debate on migration. And this has led to changes in the legislation, both on national level and EU level. But how do you think this affects our view of people on the move? How does it affect our view on our fellow human beings? Ben, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think it's certainly, I think it goes beyond the security question. I think it's a question in the whole migration debate, including around when we reduce people to economic units, that's also dehumanizing. And when we say, well, we want migrants, but only the highest value, the ones who are really going to most boost the economy. We want people basically as fuel for the economy rather than as human beings. It's a broader trend, but it's absolutely there in security questions too. And it's there in the language when you hear, the language of vermin, invaders, criminals. These aren't kind of things people are embarrassed to say, that they say them very openly. And the overall impact of that, I think, is dehumanizing. It is to strip away from people on the move their personhood and their identity as human beings. And of course, there's long-term consequences to that. And we see that in the violence directed against refugees. We see it in public debates. And I think, from a church point of view, as a church employee, I think that's also it goes to the heart of our kind of theology as well, about seeing people as, Christianity is an incarnational faith. It's a Trinitarian faith, which is based on relationships and the idea that you see, you see God in other people, and that you welcome angels without realizing it. This is central to the notion of what Christianity and a Christian vision of society is. And so a fundamental task is pushing back against that dehumanization. It's putting faces rather than kind of numbers back into that kind of debate.
Thank you. It's very, very interesting. So Mårten, you work at a law center. You're a general secretary for a law center. Do you think you should only look at the laws and the legislation, giving legal advice, or should you also be involved in this discussion on how we view people on the move and of human dignity and so on?
Yeah, yes, of course. And I would say that for every lawyer and everyone concerned with law, particularly perhaps when it comes to human rights and international legal principles, we should not forget that what are laws? Laws are codified values. That's what they are. Someone's values, if you want. And those values are fundamental for our work. I mean, in our case, we base it on the Universal Declaration for Human Rights, which is not only a declaration, it's also a manifestation of certain values, notably the universalism of human value and human rights, and therefore human rights. So of course we need to keep that in mind and bring that with us, and we need to remember why we do what we do. And I think I couldn't agree more with what Ben said. From my point of view, it's very much to contribute to make this is a debate about humans, about real people, about put faces to the statistics, because of course this whole pretext around in the debate around migration, linking it to national security threats and terrorism and disorder, of course it's absurd, and it need to be it's impossible for people not to be when faced with this wave of distrust in the other, that they are, not least from the political side, in the political debate. It's impossible to not to be affected by it. And I think the least you could expect from political leaders, if they cannot refrain from following the popular debate and the popular opinion, at least they should not push the popular opinion into that corner. And that's what's happening today, and that's where we have to make an important contribution in the other end. So.
Thank you. I think we could continue talking for several hours on this topic. We are starting to run out of time. There are no questions in the chat, so I'm thinking you have answered crystal clear on everything. But I have one last question for the both of you. And we've been talking about threats and the negative development in the area of migration. But how do you find hope in your work around migration? Mårten.
No, I'm working in particularly in the Swedish context, even if we as a law center work also international on the European arena. But in the Swedish context, it is important to remember when we see the Eurobarometer, for instance, we do see that the Swedish population still stand out with a fairly large number of portion of the population that actually want more open society and more generous migration legislation and a more humane policy. And I think it's very important to take the role. Sweden is a country with very few actors within migration in civil society compared to most other countries. And I think that the reason behind that is perhaps that we have had a political consensus up until 2015 or so, nearly, that we should have, you know, a fairly humane policy in place. And therefore, the role now, when this is not the case anymore, of the role now of civil society is more important than ever. And I think we can find comfort in the fact that we know that many are with us, and many actually do need to see that somebody stands, that some stand up and go first in this, if you want to call it, fight for human rights, which this is about, and to be able to mobilize, because there are many that think like we do.
Ben, how do you find hope?
I think I wish I'd screenshotted my inbox after the government announced its most recent kind of huge piece of legislation, because it was full. It was full of people who were angry, and it was full of people who said, "What, I've got a church. What can I do to help refugees?" And I think that's always a really powerful reminder that you know, in a sense, who cares about the kind of big public opinion thing, as long as there are enough people who are standing up and doing it. And we had so many volunteers come forward to house Afghans. We had too many volunteers come forward for some parts of the Afghan refugee scheme. So you know that's incredible, and I think things like that really do kind of reassure you that it's not all bad.
Thank you both, Mårten and Ben, for this very interesting conversation here today. And to you who are listening and watching, thank you for being here for this talk. And don't forget to check out the program for A Week of Neighbors. There are still several interesting lectures and workshops left. For example, one is the Church of England seminar on Afghan evacuees in the UK, just starting now at 3 o'clock. And don't miss out on our closing event, Keeping Our Humanity, live on Thursday at 3:30 p.m. Central European Time. Once more, thank you and goodbye.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you.